This is the second part of the assignment tips video. Now, before I start talking about mediation and how to conduct a mediation using path analysis, I want to very briefly address the question I have on the screen at the moment. Why do I need to use the Jacquard et al. Excel file? Now, I addressed this very briefly in class last week, but I'll do it again briefly now. Basically, when you conduct a moderated regression, you will end up with some output that probably looks something like this. Okay, your first step might be a test of covariates or variables you want to control for. Your second step will be your IV and your moderator. And the third step will be the test of your interaction term. Now, basically, if your interaction term is significant, or in other words, if you have a significant F change value at step 3, then that indicates that you have a significant moderation. Now, this is all that SPSS tells you. It will just tell you that your moderator is significant. If you then want to go and follow up that effect and actually look at how it's significant and how the relationship between the IV and the DV depends on the moderator, then you need to follow up this effect. And SPSS can't follow this up for you. In order to follow it up, you need to use some kind of external program such as Microsoft Excel. So what we have is we have an Excel program that has a number of macros in it that will actually automatically run this simple slope analysis for you. So it basically saves you time, otherwise you'd have to do a lot of these calculations by hand. Now, this is the Excel spreadsheet that you will enter your data into. And basically you get the data for this spreadsheet from your SPSS outputs. Once you've entered the data into this spreadsheet, you will get a plot that looks something like this. Okay, now this is a very strong interaction, which is why we have the relationship between the IV and the DV in completely opposite directions depending on the moderator. Now, one thing I will point out is when you do use Excel to actually enter this data, make sure you enable the macros. If you don't enable the macros, then you won't actually be able to get a plot like mine. Another thing I'll point out is that in order to get this plot, you may need to change your scale on your y-axis. Otherwise, the actual interaction might be above or below where the axis currently sits at. Now, some of you are having a little bit of trouble understanding exactly when you would use a moderated multiple regression. If you're having no trouble with this and you're completely confident about this, then simply skip ahead for the next 2 or 3 minutes. For those of you who are having a bit of trouble understanding this, I'll go through a very brief example. And the example that I'll go through was the same example I went through in class a couple of weeks back, which relates to my work on help-seeking behavior in adolescence. Now, basically what I looked at was what predicts mental health help-seeking behavior in adolescence. And I used a famous model, or a model that's widely used in the area of physical health, and applied this to mental health. Okay, this hadn't actually been done before. My initial research question was quite basic. It was, which of these health beliefs actually predict help-seeking behavior, so whether or not someone will see a doctor or a psychologist about mental health concerns in adolescence. Okay, so that was the general gist of the study. What I actually found was this. Overall, I had 4 significant predictors of help-seeking behavior. So when adolescents were to perceive benefits in seeking help, they were highly likely to seek help. When they were to perceive barriers, they were less likely to seek help. When they were extroverted, they were more likely to seek help. And when they had a lot of social support, they were less likely to seek help. Now, one thing in particular in these findings intrigued me, I suppose, the most, and that was this non-significant finding here, that there was almost no relationship at all between susceptibility, so how susceptible someone thought they were to a mental health issue, and whether or not they plan on seeking help. Now, this surprised me because logically you'd think that the most susceptible people would be the ones who would most likely seek out help. But like I said, there was no evidence for this in the sample. So I thought I'd look at this relationship in a bit more detail. And I thought I'd specifically follow it up with a test of a conditional effect. Okay, so in other words, I wanted to see whether or not something moderated the relationship between perceived susceptibility and the actual intention to seek out help. And what I looked at was the variable perceived benefits. So specifically, the question I was most interested in addressing was whether or not the relationship between perceived susceptibility and help-seeking behavior is dependent on whether or not someone sees benefits to seeking out help. Okay, and this was my result. So like I said before, we had a significant interaction term, and this is what the moderation effect looked like. As predicted, when individuals saw high levels of benefits to seeking out help, then susceptibility became a strong positive predictor of help-seeking behavior. However, when individuals did not perceive benefits to seeking out help, then the higher in susceptibility they were, the less likely they were to seek out help. Okay, so in this particular case, I used moderation in order to better understand why a direct effect that I'd hypothesized to exist wasn't actually there. I followed this up with a moderation, and I actually found that the reason the direct effect didn't exist is because this direct effect was dependent on a third variable, which in this case was perceived benefits. Right, and that brings me to the end of the assignment tips on moderation. What I want to do for the rest of this video now is talk about mediation and path analysis. But before I do that, I want to point out that path analysis is not the only way to conduct a mediated regression or to test a mediation type hypothesis. The classic way to do this, the way that people actually tested this up until probably 10 years ago, was the Sobel test. This is no longer used because the methods used to assess significance are pretty much out of date. We've developed much better ways of assessing significance than what was used in the Sobel test. Now, there are two procedures that are commonly used these days in order to test for the significance of an indirect effect. And both of these procedures use bootstrapping as the way to assess this significance. The first way can be done in SPSS, and it essentially requires a complicated syntax program in order to actually calculate these bootstrap estimates. Now, we don't cover this in this course, but if your goal was simply to test a simple case of mediation, where you have one IV, one mediator, and one DV, then this is probably the best way to do it. Now, we don't use this method in this course, because in this course we want to really give you a taste of path analysis and structural equation modeling. So in this unit, we talk about how to actually conduct a test of an indirect effect using path analysis. And we do this using AMOS. Now, one of the issues with this is that in order to test a model using path analysis, you need to have sufficient degrees of freedom. Because if you don't have sufficient degrees of freedom, you can't actually assess fit. And fit is a fundamental part of testing models in path analysis. Now, to test for your indirect effect using AMOS or using path analysis, we need to actually have sufficient degrees of freedom in the model. And the most basic way to do this is to actually add variables to the model. And that's why I've actually given you this model up here as a starting point. I've added a couple of extra variables to the model. So I've added lack of training and self-efficacy. Now, I want you to see this model as a starting point. Okay, this should not be your final model because it will result in a very poor fit. What you need to do is you need to test the fit of this model, which is going to be bad, and then improve the fit using a variety of theoretical changes, things that make sense to you, and also using the modification indices. Once you get a good fitting model, you can then assess whether or not your indirect effect is significant. Okay, so what I'll do now is I will take you through an example of how to actually improve fit so that you can then test your indirect effect. And I will open up AMOS in order to do this. Now, what I want to do in this example is take you through the exercise we did in class a couple of weeks back and show you again, firstly, how to draw the path analysis and then to test the indirect effect once you have a good fitting model. Okay, so I'll bring up the AMOS file. Now, the first thing we need to do is to tell AMOS which file we will be using from SPSS. Okay, so we need to click on Data Files, File Name, and then choose wherever we've actually saved the specific file. Here it is. Right, once we've done that, we need to actually specify the model that we want to test. Now we can really test anything we want to. Obviously what we test should have some kind of theoretical background, but for the purpose of this exercise it doesn't really matter. So we'll test the model that we tested in class the other night. Now if I remember correctly, we had children predicting physical health via the amount of time people work per week and the stress that people experience. Right, so the first thing we need to do is bring up the variables in the data set, and this is them here. And we can simply just drag them across to our working area. So the overall DV was health, physical health, and it was suggested in class that children, or the amount of children someone has, indirectly predicts physical health via the hours of work they do per week and their stress levels. But it was also predicted that age should be a predictor of physical health. Right, so now what we need to do is we need to put in those proposed pathways, and we simply do that like this. And the last thing we need to do is to assign error terms to each of our endogenous variables. And we simply do that by clicking on this icon and clicking once or twice on each of our endogenous variables. Now to name those endogenous variables, we click on Plugins and Name Unobserved Variables. That automatically assigns a name to each of our error terms. Right, we're just about finished. All we need to do before we run this analysis is specify the analysis properties. So we need to click on View, Analysis Properties, Output, and then we click on the various output that we want. Okay, we always want standardized estimates. We want modification indices. We want indirect, direct, and total effects. And we also want to set up the specific bootstrap we want. We want the bias corrected confidence intervals. And we also want to specify 2 AMOS that we want to perform the bootstrap. We can then close this, click on Analyze, Calculate Estimates. Okay, and this is our output. Remember, this is the output AMOS window and this is the input. Anytime you want to look at the output, you press this one. Anytime you want to modify the input, such as getting rid of an arrow or adding an arrow, you press that, that one there. But we want to have a look at the output. And we also want to look at the standardized estimates. So from this we can have a preliminary look at what's happening here. And you can see that there's not much of a relationship between children and hours per week. Okay, so the amount of children someone has doesn't really affect how often per week they work. Similarly, the amount of children someone has doesn't very highly impact how stressed out they are. In fact, there's a slight negative relationship there. One thing that we do have, however, is what looks like a relationship between age and physical health, such that the older someone gets, the healthier they get. We also have a negative relationship between stress and physical health. The more stressed out someone is, the lower their physical health, as indicated by that negative relationship. Let's have a look at the fit of this model. We click on View, and then Text Output. Okay, so here's the text output, and to look at the fit of the model, we click on this one here, Model Fit. Now ideally our goodness of fit index should be above 0.9. That's a little bit low. More concerning, however, is how low our CFI is. Additionally, we want to have a look at the RMSEA, and this value here should be very close to 0. Right, it's nowhere near 0. So our model at the moment isn't very good. What we want to do is we want to look at improving this model in some way. Now what you can do is you can either look at this initial model and ask yourself the question, are there any arrows that we could put into this model that make theoretical sense that aren't already there? Okay, so maybe age might impact the amount of children someone has. Okay, that makes sense. Let's have a look at the modification indices. The modification indices tell us from a statistical point of view whether adding a covariance or a regression pathway will actually increase fit and how much it will increase fit. So look at these modification indices now, and there's one here that really jumps out. It's as if we covary children and age, we're going to get a massive increase in the fit of our model. Okay, so this modification index is 145.198. Okay, so let's make this change and then assess the effect on our model. Right, so I've made that one change. Let's calculate our estimates again. We want to view the text output, and again the model fit, and we can see that we have extremely high fit indices. GFI is very high, the CFI is very high, the RMSEA is very low. The other index we need to check in order to assess fit is the standardized RMR. Now to calculate the standardized RMR, we need to click on plugins, standardized RMR, and once we have that box open, we calculate estimates. And you can see that's below 0.05 at 0.03, which again indicates that this is a very good fitting model. Right, and the last thing we really need to do is to assess whether or not any of our indirect effects are significant. We need to look at the estimates that we're interested in. So like I said, we're interested in looking at the indirect effects. So we need to click on this one here, standardized indirect effects. Okay, so we have a couple of indirect effects here. For example, hours worked indirectly impacts health by this much here, minus 0.029. Another indirect effect we have is the amount of children someone has impacts both stress and health indirectly. Okay, before we actually make sense of any of these indirect effects or these mediated type effects, we should look at whether they're significant. And that's what the bootstrap estimates actually do. So this is where we get them from. Okay, so we need to click here and then look at the two-tailed significance levels. And based on this test, we only have one significant value. Okay, so one p-value that's lower than 0.05. And that's this indirect effect here. Right, so this says that the hours someone works indirectly affects physical health. That's all it really tells us. This just tells us that there's a significant effect. The actual effect, or the standardized effect, okay, the standardized indirect effect is this value here. Okay, if we want to see if that's significant, we simply do what I did before, click on the significance value. Now it is significant at 0.003. Right, so to reiterate, hours worked indirectly affects physical health. Now if we look at our path diagram, hours worked indirectly affects physical health via stress. So what seems to be happening is that the more someone works per week, the more stressed out they are, and consequently, the lower in physical health they are. Right, so essentially that's how to conduct a path analysis. That's how to actually assess it for fit, to improve fit, and finally to assess that indirect effect. Now for the assignment, you are not going to get a model that fits as well as we did in this model. As I said in class a couple of weeks back, this was just very good luck. So for this reason, I don't want you to spend all day playing with a model, looking at modifications, trying a whole range of things in order to actually get your model to fit perfectly. It simply won't happen. All I really need to see you do is to actually attempt to improve fit by taking into account some modifications. And like I said, these can be modifications that are based on modification indices, so statistical ways of improving the model. Or you can also come up with modifications based on what makes theoretical sense. Now most of the time these two will be consistent with each other. If it makes theoretical sense to add in a path, then you'll probably get a statistic like a modification index telling you something similar. But I do just want to emphasize that you shouldn't spend hours and hours on this. This should only be a couple of hours tops. Well, that brings me to the end of my assignment tips videos. I hope these were useful. Like I said, if you have any more questions, just send me an email or come to my office and we can have a chat about your questions. Thanks.